My name is Nell Panero, and I am an associate professor of educational leadership at Hunter College at the City University of New York, a former New York City public school educator. And prior to working at Hunter College, I worked at Baruch College for many years. And I've spent a large part of my career since moving to higher education in developing, co-developing and researching and working on the strategic inquiry model of school improvement through leadership development.
I'm Joanna Yip. I am a multilingual learner education consultant. I partner with different nonprofits, schools, districts, and organizations focusing on their multilingual learner strategy. So I started, as a teacher. I was a college counselor for a little bit. I was an instructional coach, and English learner, multilingual learner, lead at a charter management organization, and most previously, recently, the director of state and district engagements at the English Learner Success Forum. And I work with Nell closely on doing this work around strategic inquiry that we're excited to share.
Before I explain what it is and how it works, I want to start by just talking about some beliefs that it's grounded in as a frame. So first, it's grounded in a definition of leadership as a collective capacity to improve learning conditions for students who have been persistently and historically underserved, and to spread the capacity to keep doing so in support of educational justice. So, in other words, we really do position ourselves in this idea of leadership as collective and leadership as learning, and learning from students and with students and their families to get better and better at improving learning conditions for them to thrive. And an associated grounding belief is that transforming the system is culture work, and that to succeed, a reform effort must anticipate the cultural impediments to change and have a strategic way to shift those impediments, including and essentially the constraining beliefs and meta models that undergird the existing systems and the status quo. So I say that because I want to highlight from the start, before we get into the nitty-gritty of really what the model is, this idea that while we start with kind of grounded instructional outcomes, typically as the thing that we're working on moving, that what we're really working to do is to shift culture with the students at the center, um, as the sort of North Star of that work, and making sure that whatever we do in terms of leadership and system change and culture change is moving the needle for those kids, but that it's all connected. All of these pieces of the work, the culture, the learning, the leadership, the moving of the students and the systems is all connected. Strategic inquiry it's evolved in the context of a leadership preparation. It was actually a partnership leadership preparation program that was a funded experiment in developing leaders initially for high schools. It was funded by the Carnegie Corporation, and it was a joint project by New Visions for Public Schools and Baruch College, where I was on the faculty, along with Liz Wertzman, who was also one of the co-founders of the model at Baruch. And what we were trying to do there was develop leadership specifically for high schools. And there was a sense that, especially in large high schools, that leadership wasn't really penetrating the different silos, and that there was, a need to um, really develop distributed leadership. So the key innovation at the beginning of that grant project was to start with a team. So we had in this experiment, we had teams from schools that included the principal and a team of teachers, in some cases assistant principals, and we threw everything in the kitchen sink at them, and we're sort of trying to figure out, what worked and what was needed in developing leadership for high schools. One of the activities that we stumbled upon was this started in 2005. One of the activities that we stumbled upon was to identify a group of students who had been persistently not successful in that particular school building, and to ask the teams to study those kids, figure out what it was that they needed, take action, and move those kids along. And what we found was that over a couple of semesters, it was really hard to get the teams to act. The teams talked and they talked and they talked and they didn't act. And so when we moved into the second iteration and then the third iteration, we became really, really convinced that we couldn't let this happen anymore. And we started to try and figure out what would we need to do in terms of support, in terms of curriculum, what knowledge and skills and habits of mind did people need to be able to actually figure out what these kids who had been unsuccessful needed, what precisely they needed, and how they could take action to move those students forward. And what happened over multiple iterations was that we ultimately discovered that this was really, really hard because all of the ways that the systems worked on every level kept the status quo in place. So that the reason it was so hard, that actually the knowledge and skills that were needed to support people, not only to figure out what the kids needed, but to take action to improve it, both first for those kids and then more systemically, became almost the entire leadership development program. And so over 6 iterations, we refined and refined and refined it. We were very, very lucky that we had this very robust funding to support deep facilitator learning and research during the evolution of this process, so that not only were we being studied by a team of researchers, there was an evaluation, on 6-year evaluation by a team of researchers at Stanford led by Joan Talbert and including Milbury McLaughlin. So, an amazing, amazing research team that was giving us formative evaluation. But we were also, as facilitators and leaders of the work, doing research with them and with ourselves to figure out as we went along, what was it that would work from a curricular, leadership development curriculum point of view that would make it all the way to our goals, to move the kids, to move the systems. And we met as a facilitator team for a full day a week for 3 years. And we were able to look at the student work. And so when our goal was to identify what these kids needed and to move them forward, we were able to look at the student work and trace all the way down the line, what were we doing from our work as university instructors that was landing on the folks that were in their leadership development experience, that was moving the needle or not moving the needle for the kids, and then the systems. So we made those adaptations, and in conversation with our research collaborators, really, really learned and refined the model that became strategic inquiry, the refined version of that model. So that's the history and evolution of it. Strategic inquiry is a model of school improvement through leadership development. And it has, as we learned through the kind of practice-based uh, and research-based evaluation that led to our really understanding and refining the model, we came to realize these critical design elements that are at the heart of it. We call them the 4 T's: teams, targets, task, and training. So teams are a critical part of it because what we're trying to do is to really shift the culture, shift the status quo, shift the learning conditions for kids. And one of the things that we came to learn is that it's just too much to take on alone. Very, very clear targets at every stage of the work about what it is that you're trying to reach, what your goals are, were critical design elements in our design elements as well as very, very clear, structured, and scaffolded tasks to support people in reaching those targets, and training. We did come to learn that having someone who's trained in the work as a facilitator at some point in the process is a critical design element. And the reason for that is that because the work is culture change, that and so countercultural within existing systems at various junctures of the work, absent a skilled facilitator, someone who actually has been through the work before and can kind of help the team kind of go in the direction that might not be the one they would tend to go in at critical moments in time, is a critical design element. So, people can be trained in all kinds of ways. Sometimes people are trained because they are on a team that's led by someone else and then they're trained. Sometimes people are in a leadership development program where they have experiences that lead to training. It doesn't need to be like a long, intense depth thing, but people need to have had an experience, especially well, I'm going to explain the 3 phases of the work in a minute, but especially in the first phase. They need to have a facilitated experience, and then they are able to lead it for others. The critical principle that really surfaced through the research of the model as it was developing was this idea of getting small to make a big difference. And I think that getting small is perhaps the most critical aspect of what makes strategic inquiry, and I'll explain that in a few moments. And then it also has three phases of work: moving students, moving systems, and moving colleagues. So here are the three phases: moving students, moving systems, and moving colleagues. And of course, it's a theory, and real life is always more complex than a theory, but it is a theory that was tested and grew out of the practice-based research that we did over a number of years. And these don't have to be taking place in a linear fashion. Sometimes you're moving students, concurrently with moving a system. Sometimes you go in various orders, but we do start with phase one. And I'm going to talk through a little bit about the purpose of each phase. So in phase one, a team works together to identify a group of students who have been historically underserved and have been unsuccessful in a particular school or district, and really, really focuses on identifying something very precise that those students need to learn, need to be able to do, that's high leverage. We think if they could do X, it would make a big difference in Y. And their job is to become extremely precise in figuring out what those students need and to move it. Okay. Um, the point I want to make here is that what's most important in phase one is not actually moving the students. I mean, of course, we care about moving the students, but what's most important in phase one is the aha that the team has. And this happens really reliably and really, really quickly when you have, this being implemented, which is that they move the kids in something that they didn't think they could do. And when that happens, they have an aha: oh my God, the problem's not the kids. When we have the information that we need, we can move them forward, and they become really galvanized as agents of change. And that's the primary thing, because then what they're doing in the later phases is, in terms of moving a system, they're then analyzing how the learning conditions of the school work in ways that have created those particular problems for those particular kids, and then applying the strategic inquiry process of drilling down, identifying root causes, becoming extremely precise, and applying cycles of inquiry to making changes to one system at a time, usually, um, that will bring those students into the sphere of success and others like them. So, and then the moving colleagues is leading others to learn the same kind of work until these things are all kind of moving and you have an engine of continuous learning and continuous improvement. What we're doing when we study, um, when a team is studying a group of students in the strategic inquiry model in phase one, sort of reflected in this graphic. If you imagine that the black circle here is a school, and that the blue circle here, the filled in blue part, is the sphere of success. We have this idea that every school has a sphere of success, and every school has some group of students for whom what you're doing is working in terms of your goals, whatever your goals are. And, some schools, it's a small circle that's working. Some schools, that blue might be almost the entire circle. And the idea with strategic inquiry is that we bring a team together, and they're looking at a group of students, a small number of students, who are outside the sphere of success, and trying to figure out what they need and how to move them forward in getting what they need. Um, the point here, though, is that you're not just really looking at the students. What you're doing, and the reason why it's important that you pick students who are not successful according to whatever your goals are, is because what you're really doing is looking at a biopsy of the system. We're really talking about analyzing the system. So it's really important that we get small, because if we don't get small, we're not going to be able to see the flaws in the system that we need to fix. I'm going to give you an example of why we need to get small. Let's say we're studying these students and we identify, for example, that they're struggling with writing. And then we look at the learning conditions of the school. There are lots of learning conditions that create the environment in which students learn and experience school. So one is the curriculum system. So if, the curriculum system, what we teach, how well we teach, systems of curriculum, pedagogy, professional development, supervision, etc. So if we analyze the system in light of what the kids need in a big way, it's the problem is not going to get surfaced. So if we say, for example, our students are struggling in writing, do we teach writing? The answer will be yes. So the problem won't be visible. If we drill down, however, and we realize, oh, they're struggling in development, well, that might still be too big. If we say, well, are we teaching them development? The answer will probably still be yes. But when the teams pinpoint what precisely the kids are struggling with, in the example of this team, they had actually drilled down more narrowly than development and said, actually, these students, we didn't know this, but we now realize they don't know how to use these sequencing transitions. They don't actually know how to use them, what these words signal. Um, but and then we taught it to them, and then they rapidly moved forward, and suddenly they could develop their paragraphs very well. When you look at the system through that lens, do we teach that? The answer is no. And in fact, what our teams found in almost every single case was that the thing that they identified the students that they were studying needed was not in the curriculum, which is why in strategic inquiry, a major lever for improvement that the teams have found is often curriculum. So it's putting the teaching of the skills that the students lack into the curriculum. But more importantly, the more powerful system change is really saying, how do we make decisions about what goes in our curriculum? And how do we make sure that we are making decisions not based on the pacing calendar, not based on something sort of up here, but in response to evidence of what students need, and not just the average student, but the students who are outside the sphere of success.
I think it's also identifying that skill gap and the team's sort of hypothesis or beliefs about what would move the students forward. And that they have to go through in strategic inquiry this process of identifying what they feel is high leverage, what they believe, and the facilitator is, helping the team navigate that. And I think that's what's different, right? Like, we know students have skill gaps, but what makes strategic inquiry this process that really drives the team's learning is this piece around their ability to identify something that they didn't, like, they weren't really sure, and they had to kind of push their own learning edge, right? Like, get to that piece around, like, what is unknown for us.
And they have to get there with evidence.
Yep.
So that's what really pushes them against their assumptions, right? Because they think it's something at the beginning, or they think the kids can't do it. And so what happens here when they really, really get small, what happens is that when they're small enough, it's something they can teach to very rapidly. And they see the kids make progress very rapidly. And we've seen this over and over again, this aha that happens, and it's almost like this, and this is what we're going for in phase one. This is what we want for this breath and this, oh my God, and this kind of collective, oh my God, we thought these kids couldn't do it, or we thought we couldn't do it, or both. And we now see like the problem's not the kids. When we have the information that we need, they move forward right away. The problem's not the kids. And that's the major, major change that we're going for in that first phase, right?
Yeah, and that the problem that seemed so like looming and overwhelming, that the team could then see their own efficacy in being able to, because it was so actionable, right? Because getting small enables them to be actionable, could start chipping away at the problem.
Yeah.
That they didn't before ever feel confidence in being able to do anything about. They just kind of thought, like, this is always going to be the case. It's always going to be like this for this group of students.
And so when we're talking about getting small, we're talking about a small team, right? Starting with a team, a a target population of students where you can study a small group to really go deep, very, very deep with that group. That represents a larger group, and a very, very precise identified gap that gets small enough that it's we know what to do. Like everyone sort of people often say, well, how are we supposed to know what to do? When you figure out that they don't know the meaning of finally, you know what to do. you're going to teach them finally. And why, as you were saying, Joanna, because it makes this overwhelming work of change feel really manageable and people can feel effective. It really illuminates the flaws in the system. It makes them crystal clear. And I think most importantly, because of the way it shifts hearts and minds and galvanizes teacher teams as leaders of change. They feel that they are leaders, they can be leaders, they feel driven to support others to have the same kind of learning that they had. Um, and they're charged up. So again, I think, one of the questions that I often get is, okay, so I understand why you want to get small to develop efficacy, but how is that going to change a building? And I think it's because it's operating on many cylinders at once. So in this thing of getting small around particular students' skills who are outside the sphere of success and moving them, I now, to link back to its origins, I now think that doing that, just doing that, involves so many things that are so hard because they're just not things that are typical in the system, right? It's not typical in the system to spend so much time focusing on those particular kids, to make space for that kind of deep learning. It's not typical in the system for us to collectively learn those kids that we might want to put over there with the SPED teacher or the multilingual learner teacher. It's not known really, except for by some special educators and speech language pathologists and some multilingual learners, how to really break down tasks into their discrete parts, how to really identify those and create more granular assessments than exist in our current system to give very precise information that's, geared towards teachers that would help me know what to teach the next day. For instance, if a school comes to us and they want to do the work, we plan with them, where is it going to start and how might it grow? When I think about the work at New Dorp High School, where I worked as a facilitator for many years and where the model grew, I mean, we were still figuring out the model when I was there. If, like, at the beginning, it lived among a certain teams and then it grew out to other teams. And then when the work became its most mature, after 5 or 6 years, it's almost like it didn't live anywhere because it lived everywhere. So I think it moves when it's very mature out of being linked to a particular structure and more into the habits of working and being and thinking. So it's almost like, someone asked when they were visiting that school way late when it was mature, and I remember them asking the principal, like, well, where is it now? And we sort of looked at each other and we were just like, it's just everywhere. Like it's sort of like we just think about, we're having this problem here. How do we think about that? How can we identify a clear problem? How can we look at the evidence? How can we, you know what I'm saying?
Well, maybe I'll start with like how I kind of joined Nell on this journey myself, as an educator that had been working in classrooms and schools serving multilingual learners primarily, and just really trying to understand how to not just how teachers can make a difference for a small group of students at a time because they are very good at what they do, but how do we enable schools at scale, right, to be able to serve multilingual learners better, right? So we started working together because our country's demographics have changed significantly and teachers are not equipped to serve those students. Like those students outside of that blue circle of success in that diagram are now basically in all pockets of the country in ways that didn't even exist when we started doing this work together, right? We have 5 million plus million strong students whose primary language is not English. And the numbers of multilingual learners are only growing, but most schools are not set up to respond to their needs. So for me, that group of students was always the primary focus for me personally, right? As an educator, as a language and literacy leader. And I really was looking for answers, right? For how to do this, to accelerate the change. And so I kind of bring that up because I think it is about that idea of really honing in on, those students who are not successful, that systems are not successful at serving. Um, so I think a lot about this one team that I worked with in a school doing strategic inquiry. It was a newly formed team of teachers, and their school-wide priorities were around how to serve their multilingual learners, right? They knew in their data that those were the kids outside of that sphere of success. It was a newly formed team, right? This team had very limited previous experience of, looking at evidence together, making decisions collectively together, even functioning as a team together. The team leader was a wonderful assistant principal, but who was also new to serving multilingual learners herself, and knew that she had to learn alongside her teachers in doing this. Leading the team through those, that phase one of the process, right? But eventually, co-leading and working with that assistant principal to lead the team herself, right? And supporting her to do so on her own. I think what makes this really unique and powerful is the way that the process changed the leader and her role, right? Enabling her to shift from being just an instructional leader, right, to really a learning leader, right? Moving from just being a more expert supervisor, giving teachers feedback, but actually seeing her role in leading and facilitating the learning process for her teachers, right? And that was a critical understanding in her own formation, in her leadership journey, right? And meeting with me to reflect on her facilitation, getting feedback, and us problem solving around how to manage the team's reactions and emotions when they hit up against challenges and obstacles that they were facing, and then reaching that, facilitating in ways that help the team reach greater understanding, insight, and, of course, right, results in student outcomes, right? Moving multilingual learners for the whole school in a way that they had never done before, right? I think that part of it is what makes strategic inquiry, maybe unique in other improvement models or approaches, right? And ultimately, but doing so in a way that kind of brings the people, the development, the adult development, the learning and growth, the leadership development, the curriculum and pedagogy, and that focus on a group of students that really needs more attention. I always say, like, where as strategic inquiry enables us to learn from our students and make visible what is often invisible to educators, because they come from an English dominant, monolingual perspective, right? And literally those students' cultural and linguistic assets, what they're able to do is invisible to many, many educators, but strategic inquiry puts it in their face. They have to look at it, right? And they have to understand what kids are actually bringing to the table, right? To bringing to their own learning, and what we are, deliberately or not, like, not acknowledging or ignoring, right? Yeah.
So I'm going to illustrate that exact point with an example that's in the strategic inquiry book, which is that there was a team that at Newdorp High School, there was a team that was working with a group of kids and moving them forward in writing, and they were having a lot of success, and as they would say, moving most of their kids along. And there were three kids who happened to be multilingual learners, and they weren't writing anything. And the other kids were moving along, and this was like towards the end of the year, and they wanted to. And so, when I met with them, they were like, okay, we're doing really great. These kids are all moving. These kids, we don't know what's going on with them. They're not writing anything. We can't help them. We're going to give them to the multilingual learner person, department, whatever. And so, my move in that moment was, okay, it was a few weeks till the end of the year, but I was like, okay, in this next 2 weeks or this next week, like you just need, forget about the other kids. You can just focus on these kids. And I want you to do one thing that will help you make one step forward in figuring out where they're getting stuck. And they were very upset about it because they were like, we don't know what to do. And they were having all this progress with the other kids. They really just wanted to push those kids to somebody else. And so this is kind of why you need a facilitator too, because I think in the culture we're sort of like people are used to saying like, 80% of our kids are moving, good job, and move on. Whereas in strategic inquiry, we're like, okay, great, you're doing great with them. Let's look where it's not working. Not because we want to be critical, but because that's where the learning is, right? What they ended up doing was they ended up giving the same assessment to these kids in Spanish and finding out that these kids were wonderful writers in Spanish. And that was when they had their aha. They were blown away. And what happened is, I mean, okay, this is a good example about what really matters in phase one of the inquiry process. Did they move those kids forward, those three kids? Not a lick. The kids had the same abilities at the beginning that they did at the end. But what moved, but those teachers were never the same. They became like real leaders because they were like, oh my God, we thought these kids didn't know anything. The page was blank. And we realized that our assessment was flawed. We just weren't tapping into be able to see what they know. And now we realize our ideas about their abilities, what they need are completely different. We can't make assumptions. Then they were then leading teams the next year and they were like, but how do you know? Right? They just had a different belief when they looked at a blank page about what that meant and how they needed to not make assumptions and to get really much better and more granular information in order to inform their decisions. Sometimes I hear a conversation where people will say you need to have these conditions in place in order for this model to work. Um, and I guess what I'll say here is that this model was born out of difficult conditions, right? So the question really on the table, like, so a lot of times people say, like, you have to have a certain level of trust, or you have to have this, or you have to have that. I guess what we'll say is like, we never had that. What we had, the only condition that had to be was there had to be some time for teachers to meet. And that time had to be protected. And there had to be someone who could facilitate who had some training. Could be from the outside, could be from the inside. But aside from that, the model is designed to expect resistance and it's the structured process of starting quickly with students and identifying like very concretely something very like getting very quickly to looking at the student work and figuring out something that they need that is the thing that brings people around. And so, we team after team after team, like it's wrangling cats, herding cats to get people to be there, teams complaining, everybody going out for a smoke break. I don't even think like people do that anymore. Like that was actual cigarettes. But you know, complaining about the kids, complaining about being there. That was all part of it. And so we had to figure out like, okay, what are the things that are going to grab people quickly and that are going to shift that? And that's what the model's designed to do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is too reductive, but like we always like to quote Heifetz, right, around adaptive versus technical challenges. And a lot of improvement efforts, I think, try to tackle the technical issues that are very complex. It takes a lot to build good curriculum. Like, I'm not saying that those are not complex issues, right? But we still keep kind of coming back to the same place around that group of kids still stays in outside of that blue circle, right? And it's because we're not addressing the adaptive elements, the cultural aspects of it, right? The pieces around how teams agree and commit to one another around what they're doing for kids and how to do that, and getting small helps them get there faster And so yeah, I think that to me that's the
And the
difference.
beliefs. And the beliefs. Got to get at the beliefs.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
sometimes people will say, I think, for this kind of work to work, you have to believe in kids. And my feeling is like everybody thinks they believe in kids, right? And so, you know, having an experience where you're pushed up against and can see and name and confront and disconfirm those beliefs and reveal those beliefs to yourself, like that's the thing that changes people. The biggest challenge that comes up is that when teams do the work, they surface typically very foundational needs that kids have. And the work started off in high schools. We work in every level, but it's kind of hardest in high school, right? Because if you're going to be surfacing that kids are struggling to write a sentence and they're being asked to write a 5-page essay, um, it's obviously attention and that needs to be managed, and it's very, very hard. But the places where the principal or the leader doesn't isn't really able to live in that tension and is more doesn't see like so what ideally happens in that kind of situation is typically what happens is the pacing calendar, the external pressures are driving, and the kids who are outside the sphere of success just keep being outside the sphere of success. Ideally, in a strategic inquiry environment, you're surfacing the needs and then you're collectively saying, what are we going to do about this tension, right? How are we going to both address their needs and move them to the standards? And working at that tension together. And it's a complex thing to manage, but we're facing reality together and working at it in the context of reality. The places where that can't happen, it's sort of like a leader who just can't manage that tension, can't really deal with it, and can't make space for it. And so keeps putting pressures on teachers just to kind of, it's too hard for them to be surfacing that and seeing that they need to respond to it in an environment where they're not supported to be allowed to respond to what they're seeing.
I guess it's a little bit of like, do they want to play this game? Like, do they want to do this kind of work? I think, where, um, there's a little bit of like ambiguity, right? The team is going to be hit up against things that they are not comfortable with, that they're not familiar with, and a willingness to lead in that space, to be willing to create time, that protected time for that deeper learning to happen. Like in my experience, I think the other piece is when when the team or the leader or the leader, usually it's and the leader, like aren't really willing to like look at the evidence. I think really look at the evidence and use it as a reflection of what's telling them is needed in their system. There's lots of reasons why people don't want to do that. I don't know, fear, not knowing what the right answer is, being afraid that they don't know what the right answer is, all of that, all of that. So I think it's about an orientation, right? An orientation to what it takes to solve complex problems within the organization. In an alternative universe, somebody could have just come into New Dorp High School and said to the principal, "Hey, do this writing curriculum." You know what I mean? Like in 2007, right? They could have just been like, "Hey, send all your teachers. Every single one of your teachers has to go to this PD for this writing curriculum."
Yeah.
And the end result would have been a great experience for those teachers. But the end result would not have been that these practices and these habits of mind and these ways of doing things were now everywhere. And it didn't live in one place, but it lived everywhere in that school, right? And we know that that school was one of the few schools that didn't get closed down as a comprehensive high school, right,
Yep.
in the city because of that. So
Yeah.
I think
That school
there were
moved its graduation rate between 2005 and now from 53% to I think 82%.
right.
Um, and was featured in the Atlantic magazine and all of that. But what's sometimes lost in that story, it's featured for the writing work because that's what we chose to feature in the Atlantic, but it's really the inquiry that made a foundation that could absorb the writing work because when they went to those PDs, they, as you were saying, Joanna, they knew exactly what their students were struggling with and what they needed to move them. They knew exactly.